pause. And we are now good to go again, Cormac. You may proceed. Action. Apologies again for that. So I have selected this information. I am running on a timeline, which you will be able to see a chronicle of Cornelius Flavin's life. There are gaps in knowledge of his life. While I do have ample information on him, I still see a lot of gaps. So I'm having to fill in the gaps in some way to get an idea of his life. The information that I have got of him with regard to his name, it was often mentioned in collaboration with his name, the use of deaf mute, deaf and dumb. So that's how I have been able to capture him. The name in itself is rare. So that has made it a lot easier for me to be able to retrieve this information. Some information mentions him as deaf mute, while other information, such as court proceedings, it does not state that he is deaf. Also, within articles in the newspapers, there was not much published about him. But what information I do have, I will now present on. Prior to the conference beginning, I was speaking with the panel early this morning, speaking about Cornelius Flavin. An interpreter stated that he was in fact a Kerryman. I, on the other hand, had said because he was from Tarbert, that he was on the border of Limerick. The interpreter stated that Tarbert is in fact Kerry. I have taken a step back from that. I do not want to be involved with the Kerry mafia on those grounds. Anyway, having a little bit of a side joke here. Cornelius Flavin is from Tarbert, born in 1862. Information that we have on his parents: his father was a gamekeeper who was responsible for looking after the deers. So this was his role. His father died while Cornelius was a young boy, while the mother was pregnant with her 5th child at that time. Cornelius grew up and was identified as being deaf, sent to St. Joseph's in Cabra by the local board of guardians. And that was in a town known as Glynn, and that's where the board of guardians resided. They were willing to fund his time in St. Joseph's. So from 1869, he remained there and returned in and around 1877, 78. It looks like Cornelius had family members who were deaf. This is not a definite, but we can see that there were siblings. There is information from their baptisms records, and also records from St. Joseph's and St. Mary's when people entered into these schools. They were of the same age, the years collaborated. There were 5 children. It would appear that the 4th was hearing and all the other siblings deaf, the eldest being Cornelius Flavin. However, with the others, it would seem that the relationship was quite touchy. The first occasion when he ended up in court was in Tarbert. This was Tarbert Courthouse, which is now a museum. I have yet to visit here. It's on my list of things to do. In 1878, he was brought to court on the grounds of beating up his younger sister, Mary, who at the time was only 7. So the mother, in a distressed state, got him to court. Now, as to what happened on the day with Cornelius and his mother, it would appear that they did not turn up, that the case may have been dropped. In the same year, 6 months later, again, another sister by the name of Joanna, Cornelius again beat her up, and again they did not turn up in court. So he was not sentenced or given a prison sentence at this stage. Two years later, however, in 1880, it would appear that his aunt, Margaret Flavin, he threw an iron at her and again was brought to court, charged and imprisoned for 2 months. And he was held in prison in Tralee Jail, which is no longer in existence now. There was an interpreter by the name of Daniel Conway, who was in court. Do not know, is he a family member, somebody that was very good or fluent in sign language? However, he did get a sentence of imprisonment for 2 months. Now, he now started to travel to other countries, which is of great interest. He was on a great adventure. So in 1883, Cornelius' mother decided to emigrate to New York. Cornelius wanted to follow in her footsteps. At the same time, the Glynn Board of Guardians, again, were willing to pay people to emigrate to America. So people were able to travel by boat. Cornelius was one of those who was wanting to go to America, which he did do. He arrived in Boston in the year 1883, in the month of July, and he was on the ship, the Austrian ship. So this is a picture of it here. Set sail to Boston, and let's see what happens next on this infamous misadventure in America. Here we can see that when he arrived, it would seem that he was unable to locate his mother. The money that he did have, he spent very, very quickly. The police then eventually arrested him for begging, sent to the workhouse, maintained there in Massachusetts workhouse, remained there, and while there, those who controlled the workhouse wanted to know what they were going to do with this Irish person and decided to send him back home to Ireland. So this happened 5 months after arriving to America. That adventure only lasted 5 months, on the 18th of December, 1883. So I went locating information for the years 1884 and 85. However, I wasn't able to locate anything until 1886. And I did find a piece of information on a London workhouse. And again, it stated Cornelius Flavin in these records.
So he stayed there for 2 months, left. 2 days later, came back to Ireland, to Limerick City. And here we have, so he arrived back in Ireland in 1886, And going forward until the 1920s, Cornelius has been found to be traveling all over Ireland, begging, homeless, troublemaker, in court, in prison, in workhouses for almost 30 years. How incredible. I would have assumed that he would have walked all over Ireland. He may have hitched a ride on the horse and trap. And Veronica said to me recently, it could have been hitchhiking. I think, oh yeah, you might be right. But most of the time, I would imagine that he would have walked around Ireland. What a hard life to have. So here in Ireland, back in the day, there were many workhouses to be found all over Ireland, and Cornelius has had a presence in many of them. Here are some examples of the workhouses that he was found around Ireland. I am sure that there are more, but many of the workhouses and their records in terms of dates, times in, times out, many of them would no longer be available or destroyed. Now, there are some that have been found, and here you can see examples of where Cornelius has been. Now, for most of the time, Cornelius would not stay for very long. He would like 1 night, 2 nights, would come in, would leave often. Now, back in the day, homeless people were there of short duration. So the next day they would go looking for either food, boarding, work, and then would come back to the workhouse again for a short period of time. So looking at his court appearances, look at all of the court appearances he's made all over Ireland. This is what I have found. I'm sure there's more that have not been mentioned, but I have no doubt he has made more appearances. So now we're looking at the prison sentences. I'm going to show different examples of where and for how long. So just watch the slides, the next few slides. These are examples of the crimes that he had committed: drunkenness, vagrancy, begging, and so on. But most often it was in relation to drunkenness and begging. I do not have a photo of Cornelius through my research, but the prison records have given a description of what he would have looked like in terms of his head, his hair, his height, his weight. And here are 2 examples. One was early, the other one was late. And see, you can compare, you can see his height, his eyes. Now, there were some changes that can be cited. His weight, he became slimmer, obviously, with the travels around Ireland. But what was another interesting thing was that it had put in deaf and dumb. Now, where would that fit in? So it was actually marked on the person, so marked on person. But years later, there was a tattoo that was on his left thumb, and it was the sign of the cross. And he also became slightly bald. Now, there are other deaf people that have had many other tattoos that have been sourced, but Cornelius, he only had the one that was on his left thumb. So here we have just one typical year, and I've chosen 1906. So you can see here, he started off in Wicklow, and it was the Rat Drum Workhouse. So he stayed there for 2 days, left, then moved on to South Dublin, and went to Rathdown Workhouse, stayed there for a night. Then, as time went on, he went to Waterford Prison, and then went on to Wexford. So he was caught for begging, went to court, and sent to prison in Waterford. Left, then went to Rathdrum Workhouse, back to Wicklow again. Then went to Rathdown. So can you see how many nights? So it was 2, 1, 7, and so on. So he was in prison for 7, and then you got a series of 1, 1, 1, and then ended up in Navan. That was just in 1 year on foot. So Cornelius was summoned to court. So let's look at communication. So it looks like Cornelius was well able to write. No mention of interpreters, but always in writing, but something with the same excuse. So as and when he was arrested, it was assumed he was homeless, and he would write and say, no, 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 and would always say, quote unquote. There are 2 different examples that are here on this slide. So the first one you can see is Navan, and then the other one is Dundalk. Both of them with the same excuse. Oh no, I wasn't drunken. I was looking for where I needed to sleep. I couldn't find anything and I was ever so tired. That's all. So he was well able to lie in writing, or he may have been serious, but this is what the newspaper articles would have said. So written by a hearing journalist, would they have known sign language? We don't know. And another interesting point about Cornelius, he would use a false identity. He would change his name. And back then, now, how they would know that that person was the same? So if a person was in prison or found in court, is by the writing of information that had been documented. So if a person was arrested, they were asked for their names. They would look through the records and saying, okay, this person was in prison, so they would get a heavier sentence if they were convicted 2 or 3 times. But if they had lied and said, oh, that's a fake identity, or it's the first time, okay, we'll give you a lighter sentence. So Cornelius did have a false identity, and the name that he used was Samuel Sloan. So can you see here on the slide, the prison records, and look at how the name down in the bottom left. So the guards knew, they caught him, and they knew that he had a false identity because of the signatures. So he could no longer use that false identity because he had been identified as using it. So one of the major cases that he had was in 1900, he was arrested for arson. He had gone into a pub, wanted a drink, and he was dismissed. He was refused. He got angry and lit fire to the place. He was arrested. He went to court in Wicklow. He used a false identity by the name of Samuel Sloan. And what was interesting here is that the court had said there is no interpreter, but one gentleman raised his hand and said, I know the dumb alphabet. Now, what was meant by that? Finger spelling? We don't know. But that was what was said. It was, he was accepted as an interpreter. Now, I would assume at that point, it was the 2-handed finger spelling. So he would have done the finger spelling. Samuel Sloan would have watched the court proceedings, and Samuel Sloan responds back in sign, and the interpreter did not understand what was being said by him. So there was a communication breakdown. So that was the interpreter was actually the newspaper editor. So here we have another example of a few years later, Limavady Workhouse. Again, another false identity using Samuel Stone went into the workhouse, said he was deaf, and goes, oh, did you know that we have the rules? And it was interpreted to him, was what was said. Did they bring in an interpreter, or did they use a book, or did they use gestures? But Samuel Stone was seen not to be happy with the rules. And the top manager, the master of the workhouse, was annoyed, and Samuel Stone went to bed and took under the mattress straw and lit the straw, causing a fire. The master had to kick him out of the workhouse. And after that, Samuel Stone went off on a drunken bridge, was arrested and sent to prison for 7 days. Now, he did have the opportunity of visiting his home in Tarbert. And how do we know that? Is because of the court recordings. He was in court 3 times in Tarbert for drunkenness. So looking at what happened to Cornelius, now he traveled around Ireland for 30 years. He lived rough. Like, that's serious living, isn't it? But based on the research that I have collated, the last piece of information that I have found was from 1920 in the Donegal Union Workhouse. He stayed there, he left, but what happened after that, we do not know. I cannot find any other prison records. Now, he may have died. I have been unable to source a death certificate over a period of time, none to be found. Now, I have looked for him under the 2 names of Cornelius and Samuel, under both, none to be found. So I have a feeling that he was homeless and one night may have died in his sleep. And the next day may have been found, but name unknown. So so it might have a death certificate that says name unknown, but there is no definitive death certificate. And where he is buried, we do not know either. So a pretty sad ending, because he had a hard life, but all credit to him that he was independent traveler for 30 years, was able to make his own decisions, was able to travel around Ireland, you know, making his way through the countryside. He wasn't dependent on the workhouses or stayed there for years. You know, he was very dismissive. So he wasn't in any other institution. He traveled around Ireland on his own. What a man. So there you go. Thank you very much. Cormac, thank you for a wonderful, interesting presentation. What an interesting story about Cornelius and his traipsing around the place. Thoroughly enjoyable viewing. So we're now open to questions. There are none received as yet. I would like to start with one. Cormac. But to the others, would you prefer the raised hand or the question in the chat facility? But either way. So I'd like to start with the question, if you don't mind, Cormac. Now, there is one interesting part that you talked about where Cornelius was a beggar. And in 19th century Ireland back then, begging was against the law. Is that right? Yes, there were different types of laws in the 19th century, but we're looking at mid-19th century that was very strict. But after that, some were removed or replaced, or softer, so to speak, but very reliant on the police themselves individually. So one policeman could turn around and say, "Here go away." Other police officers would be more strict. So it was very much dependent on the local police, and also if they were well known. Now, when I have found other deaf people, if they have stayed within their local area and the police would know them well, there was a better chance of like, "Era, go on, you're all right, go on, go away, keep it quiet." But with Cornelius, having traveled to new different areas, the police would not know of him. And also being deaf, they may have been slightly deterred by that. But maybe there was that additional, "Oh, the poor fella, he's deaf." Thank you.
Brian Crean has a question. Hello, Cormac. A very interesting presentation on the adventures of a man and the sightings that you have found on him as a very independent person. At the start of your presentation, you had mentioned the word interpreter. Was this in an article in a newspaper? I'm shocked because growing up, I would have never seen the word interpreter. The point at which I found that out was when I was in America upon completion of my secondary school education. And it was then that I had the realization of what an interpreter was. And it took me time to actually know how to use an interpreter. But you are going back to the 19th century. Are you telling me the word interpreter was used? And if so, can you go into it in a little bit more detail? Yes, funny enough, I have read many articles in newspapers, court records. In the 19th century, it would seem that the word interpreter was used on a very regular occasion. It was used. Funnily enough, when Ireland gained its independence, the use of that word decreased. But the word was used, but when we talk about foreign languages, it continued in the word being used as the word interpreter. But the 19th century, they actually had no problem with when there was a deaf person, an interpreter was brought in. It may have stated somebody would need to be brought in so that they can understand. And I know that the word now, it's more popular that people are using the word signer. Us as interpreters are not happy with it. But in the 19th century, there was no such thing. The word interpreter was used as a given. As a verb, interpreting, and as a noun, interpreter, be it in newspaper or whatever other type of information that was out there. Why do you think the word interpreter decreased in use? Was it the likes of the NAD that may have tried to eliminate the word interpreter? Was it, do you think people like that tried to eliminate it from our dictionary? I wouldn't say that it was necessarily the NAD because that was much later. It started to decrease in the 1920s and 30s. I think prior to that time frame, England, when it was under British rule, that there was some sort of an institutional perspective. And then prior to that, it became a very charitable when it came to how they perceived deaf people. Prior to that, a deaf person required an interpreter. Now, whether that interpreter was qualified or not, we do not know, but an interpreter was in place. But after Ireland's independence, certainly, then it became that the perspective became that there was somebody there to help them. So that became prevalent. Prior to that, now the perspective was there prior to that, but certainly after Ireland's independence, that attitude became more prevalent. That is my gut instinct. but certainly it would be a great area of interest to research this in more detail. I think Philip Graham. Just one moment, please. Robert just said that I can see you. Philip, I actually can't see myself, so just one moment, please. Okay. Apologies, another moment. Cormac, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. It has given me plenty of food for thought. So when we look at the 1890s, when he was moved to St. Joseph's, siblings went to St. Joseph's and St. Mary's. Both stayed in schools, and then they came home, but in actual fact, they didn't have a sibling relationship. The reasons why they probably didn't get on with each other and he had no problem with beating up this person is because he did not perceive them as siblings. So when we look at St. Joseph's, he would have gone off to St. Joseph's and then eventually came home. So I'm sure there wasn't that relationship formed and built with them. And they probably stayed in school for a number of years and wondered, who were these people in the family home? Prior to your presentation, I would have thought that the person was uneducated until you had said 1960. And so 1860. So I would have known that St. Joseph's was opened. And yet there was the trades such as tailoring. That was already established within St. Joseph's. And yet those skills would have been there. So can I just hand that back over to you? Firstly, when we talk about the family perspective, yes, there probably was not that relationship because they weren't in the same locality. Yet, for Cornelius, when he was arrested, be it when he was drunk and sent to prison, the prison records show his name, his age, and then there would have been a detail such as the next of kin. So who is your nearest relative? And he would have always put in his sister, who was in Wicklow. So when I did my research, yes, and indeed, there was a sister who was deaf in the civil service in Wicklow. So that was documented. Now, whether or not she wanted to have a relationship with him is another thing. These are gaps that I have not been able to fill. I really would love to know this detail, but it would be of interest, hopefully, to those of you that would be willing to do this research. One of his brothers, Michael, he does remember seeing something in St. Joseph's newsletter. Michael Flavin's name was mentioned to have stayed in St. Joseph's for many years, who was blind. Prior to the presentation, I had never found this. It was never documented, and I haven't noted it, but I do think the brother who was deaf-blind remained in St. Joseph's for a number of years. Okay, so the second point on the trades. I think two different things have happened. Firstly, in St. Joseph's, they taught, but they weren't given a trade. They taught the basis of the trades and encouraged them to then go on to get an apprenticeship. But they didn't have their apprenticeship in St. Joseph's. So while they did teach, what they then went on to do was to get in contact with employers, saying that, yes, these have skills, but it wasn't an apprenticeship per se from the school. With Cornelius, he may have been taught it in school. Opportunities may not have presented themselves. He then returned home. So within the locality, because of the father who had died, and with the mother situation, that for whatever reason, there wasn't an opportunity for him to use the trades. Now, within the prisons register, there is a file on the occupation, and that was as shoemaker, which meant that it wasn't that they worked as a shoemaker, but they had the trade. They had a half a trade of a shoemaker. He may not be skilled in the craft of shoemaking. So upon leaving school, that he would have had some skills, but it wasn't that he had an apprenticeship from school. Cormac, thank you very much. Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Who do we have up next? We have Annie Murphy. Okay, so if we can get you to pop on her video. Hello, Cormac. Thank you very much for that very interesting story on Cornelius. You see me? Okay. One point of interest, when you spoke about him traveling around Ireland as a vagrant and begging, I wonder, how did he survive? Again, we're using the word thumbing, but in this instance, to hitch a ride on the horse and cart. He must have got money upon his travels so that he could feed himself. And interesting to note as a deaf person that he was able to manage. Was he fed when he was in prison? Just an interesting point to ask. As you know, and even now within prison, they had regular meals. That's the thing. Now, of the time, the food was appalling, but they did have regular meals. Very often, another interesting point is that the prison's register has noted that there was 2 columns on weight. The first column, the weight of the person upon arrival at the prison, during their imprisonment, be it 2 weeks, a month. Upon leaving the prison, again, they were weighed, and that was added into the second column, and comparisons were made. And very quickly it was seen that their weight had increased. So it would seem that prior to prison, they weren't able to eat on a regular basis, but while in prison, had regular meals and the weight went on quickly. So those in the town and the countryside, people would be willing to give them food, whereas in cities, it was more difficult for them. Their life wasn't as easy. Albeit that they lived in poverty, but it would seem that people in the countryside were more friendly. Whether the person was begging as a deaf person, you know, there was that pity on the person and food was given to them. And back then, just a point to let you know, one of the biggest problems is that there were deaf people who pretended to be deaf and they were begging because they knew that that was going to be an easier way of getting. So I have found hundreds of occasions where hearing people pretended to be deaf, wrote notes, had their pen and paper just to get it, whereas we know with Cornelius, I have found that he was in actual fact deaf, but we have found many occasions where people pretended to be deaf. Thank you, Cormac. Next, we have Liam Breen with his question. Hello there. Hi, Cormac. A very enjoyable presentation about that beggar throughout Ireland. I know that here in Kerry, there are deaf people who were cycling, traveling, and they may have worked in people's gardens. This going back to 1890 to the 1940s. Christian Brothers and St. Joseph's would see that if a deaf person was homeless, they may have been living out in the shade, they were just sleeping in hay barns, they would get in contact with people. The police would be aware of these people who were deaf and sent to St. Joseph's, so the Christian Brothers would take in deaf people. However, we would have had some people that were at the age of 60 and 70 who were begging, and yet the Christian Brothers were expected to take them in. Some people stayed as residents within St. Joseph's. In the past, we wouldn't have had nursing homes. We didn't have such buildings. And just like with the nuns, they were willing to take in older deaf women. They were expected to work while they were in residence. And there is a video of elderly deaf people, and they would have memories of deaf blind people who lived there.
So to think that there are those that were present in Cabra, but were expected to work as part of their living. So work and live in, so that they could be fed and watered and kept warm. So there are so many different stories that have been shared and have yet to be had. Now here in Kerry, the famous person by the name of Daniel O'Connell, his son, Daniel O'Connell Jr., wrote to St. Joseph's in Cabra, and there is a letter that has been preserved from 1867 in which it states, telling the Christian Brothers to take 2 deaf and dumb to Cabra. And the Christian Brothers were unaware of the age, had taken them, but both of them were late age, like 15, 16, so had no education in Kerry, so obviously slowly educated at that age. And then because of that, where were they going to live? So they remained in Cabra. So interesting to think that Daniel O'Connell Jr. would write a letter like that. So there's lots of wow factors here. But Cormac, thank you for your presentation. Noel, did you not have a question, Liam? Cormac, I'd like to very quickly respond to Liam Breen, okay? These kind of stories, and those who are homeless, deaf blind, all of those kind of stories need to be documented. I know that there are a lot of video recordings in sign language, but there's definitely a need for more to be documented. And you're right, there were no nursing homes back in the day. And if you look at Belfast back at that time, they did have, you had the Belfast Mission Hall, and they had some beds that were available for those that were unemployed or looking for work and were able to remain for a period of time. The other one was, there was a separate one available for women, and it was called the Jubilee Home. And that was established in, I think it was around about 1910, 1911, particularly for deaf Presbyterians. So for women. So they were small, yes, there were small institutes that were there, but nothing like that in the south of Ireland. Yes, we had St. Joseph's and St. Mary's that did welcome the elderly and the homeless. But of course, they were tight for money, tight for space. That was an issue. And being hard up. And the government did not subsidize or fund these services. Liam, now after, let me think, what's 1964, there was a letter that was written by it was CIDT back in the day, talking about the need for a nursing home for deaf people to be established by the nuns, stating the need where they no longer could live in the school or be resident at the school, but that they be moved to somewhere else. But as we know, that story now changes because they're moving out into community. Noel, I think we need to move on now. Liam, thank you for your question. Cormac, again, thank you for your most interesting presentation. Really appreciate it. Okay, so now we're ready for our next presentation. And it is Sister Maurice Stella McKeown, OP, and she is from our Dominicans. Sister Maurice, over to you.
Okay.
Thank you. The Dominican sisters who wrote these letters in January, July, and August of 1846 could never have imagined a conference such as today, and resulting in the origin of the Catholic deaf women's education. And just going to expand now a little on what were the contents of the letter. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this event from the perspective of our Dominican archives. The wonderful publication in 2016 of Through the Arch provides many details about the origins of St. Mary's School for Deaf Girls and the two foundresses. Today is a real pleasure to share with you information from 3 letters in our archives which relate to the origins of St. Mary's, and later we have some details on Sister Gabriel Hogan. I wish to acknowledge the help I've received in preparing this presentation, given to me by the 2 archivists, co-archivists, Sister Mary O'Byrne and David Gunning. Without their help, today wouldn't be happening for me. Next slide. The next slide is the aerial view. Okay, so we're flying into Cabra. As you can see, this photograph is a few decades old, but you see the main building of Cabra, and to the left, you see the development of the School for the Deaf Girls. So the context, what was going on in Ireland in the 1840s? What was going on in Dublin? What was going on around Cabra? We know that British rule in Ireland for centuries was located in Dublin Castle, about 2 kilometres from the home place of our first 2 deaf students, Agnes and Mary. In spite of the victory of Catholic emancipation, people were extremely poor and thus were very vulnerable to the onslaught of the Great Famine, which began to be noticed in rural Ireland early this year in 1846, the year of our letters. We may conclude from these letters that Dublin was really removed from the Great Famine, but its effects were certainly felt. People fleeing the famine made their way to an already crowded Dublin. Around that time, north of the Liffey, 10,000 people lived in a space of over 1.5 square kilometres, while south of the Liffey, 15,000 people were cramped into a space less than a square kilometre. These were the Dublin tenements, very close to the homes of our first 2 pupils. There were some innovations on the social scene. The penny post was introduced in 1840, a very welcome change, and no doubt without that, we might not have had these letters today, which were delivered in 1846. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next one.
Next slide. See it again.
Next slide, please.
She's telling me to do it.
Okay. Not a lot is known about the 2 children, Agnes and Mary. They were both Dubliners. They were deaf. They were very young, about 6 or 7. Agnes Beedham was the daughter of John and Kate Beedham of 162 Capel Street. And Agnes had 3 sisters, Teresa, Kate, and Monica. Her father was a shoemaker. She came to Cabra before the 11th of January 1846 and left it in September 1852. Mary Doherty was daughter of Michael and Marion Doherty of 9 Pendas Court, Dublin, since demolished, but then it was an area of tenements. Her father was a labourer. Mary had brothers, John and Michael, and sisters, Anna and Eliza. She came to Cabra also before the 11th of January 1846 and left in March 1849. The 2 Dominican women accompanying Agnes and Mary to Caen were Sisters Magdalen O'Farrell and Vincent Martin. Next slide, please. Sister Magdalen O'Farrell was born in Dublin in 1822 and went to the boarding school in Cabra. She eventually joined the community, making profession there in 1840 at the early age of 18. She was thus only 24 when she travelled to Caen. Sister Vincent Martin was born also in Dublin in 1823, went to the same boarding school in Cabra, joined the community, and made profession there in 1843. She was 23 when she went to Caen, just a year between herself and her companion, Sister Magdalen. Travelling with all four was Father James Lynch, one of the group of Vincentians recently arriving in Ireland. Many references are made in all three letters to Vincentians who had been appointed chaplains to Cabra by the Archbishop of Dublin in 1832. They fulfilled their obligations faithfully for many years, hence the great contact over the 19th century between the Vincentians and the community in Cabra. Next slide, please. Next slide. We may ask, why travel to France rather than England, where they would be at least learning the same language? Well, Father McNamara, a Vincentian and a chaplain in Cabra, he knew about Caen and had visited it in 1840. It was he who suggested Caen to the community as the best place where to learn methods of educating deaf people. We have noted that the two sisters were accompanied by a priest, Father Lynch. Today, it is quite common for women to travel on their own and can be trusted to make their own travel arrangements successfully. But at that time, it was felt that religious sisters accustomed to living an enclosed life should be accompanied, usually for their own physical safety, as traveling women in the 1840s was not easy. The tone of the letters certainly is one of gratitude and thanks to their escort. The priest, l'Abbé Jamet, is often claimed to be the second founder of Pont-Sauveur in Caen. In 1816, a school for the sourds-muettes, deaf and dumb, was started there. From 1820, it became one of the most famous of the medical establishments in France, and it was to this institute that the two pupils and their companions were directed. We're not told what route they followed from Dublin. We know that the party arrived at Le Havre and travelled from there to Caen. The distance from Dublin to Caen is about 1,300 kilometres, and from Le Havre to Caen is roughly 48 kilometres. Next slide, please. The first letter is addressed, as you see, to Mrs. Marr, the prioress of the Dominican convent Cabra. It is dated the 27th of January, 1946, and you'll notice there are two stamp marks. The one in black is Janvier, it came from Caen, and then obviously when it came to this part of the world, it has the second stamp above it. So Mrs. Marr was Mrs. Columba Marr, Mother Columba Marr, prioress of Dominican convent Cabra. The use of Mrs. as a title was a relic of the penal laws when women religious were seen as enemies of the state. So religious women hid their identity by the use of the secular title Mrs. Next slide, please. We see here the three letters come from Caen. Dear Reverend Mother, Father Lynch being correspondent, we deferred writing until we should be settled here. Thanks to our good God, not the least accident occurred to us while traveling. You would laugh to see us following our good leader through the crowds at the railway station. Nothing could exceed his kindness. He was our father, mother, sister, brother. We were only one day without Mass and Holy Communion. The terrible ladder awaited us at Havre. Father James advanced first, we followed, and two big sailors carrying the children closed the cortege. When we arrived at Caen, Father l'Abbé Foron came into the vessel to welcome us and then accompanied us to the Pont-Sauveur in the carriage. This is quite a new world, very strange, very different from Cabra, except that we find here the same charity on all sides. Good Father Lynch left us on Sunday evening after having given us a nice exhortation. Among other things, he told us to reject every thought of when we would be going home. But behold, he had scarcely ceased speaking when one of us exclaimed, "We have only 6 months to stay at all events." Our hours could not be better regulated. Next slide. Okay. The next slide is timetable. And so we have a rough idea of the daily timetable of the sisters. 6:30 rising, followed by prayer. 8 a.m., 7 to 8 mass, followed by breakfast. School from 8 a.m. roughly to 12 p.m. noon. And from 12 to 2 p.m. dinner, followed by rosary. 2 to 4, teaching in the school. 4 to 5, prayers, vespers, and meditation. 6 p.m. tea, followed by recreation, sometimes with the community, and sometimes with the Sourd Moet, the deaf mutes. 8:30 to 9, final prayers, followed by bedtime. So the sisters continually show their acts of kindness, endeavoring to make everything like Cabra. Next slide, please. The next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Part 2 presentation.
This is part 2 of the presentation. Slide number 9.
Okay, apologies.
Don't say slide.
Just to say that I need to close down the first presentation and I'm now going to move on to the second presentation. So if you could give me a moment, please.
All right, thank you. This is a continuation, yes.
Say what it is. Don't say the This is our next one. Part 2. Yeah. There you are, part 2. Lovely.
Thank you. Now, the deaf and dumb language is very difficult. As yet, we know little more than the alphabet and a few prayers. The system is not adapted to English yet, but we hope everything will be ready in a week or so. The children are quite happy and improving already. It is astonishing what progress the Sourd Moet make in a short time. The unwearied attention of the sisters alone accounts for it. All sacrifices imaginable appear sweet and easy when one looks at the poor Sourd Moet. There are 50 girls and 60 boys here in Caen. We've just returned from our English chat with Monsieur l'Abbé Foron. This is the second time he has had the goodness to call for us, and he sends his best regards to you. Dearest mother, it is time to give you some questions. Is Sister Joseph free from rheumatism? Has Sister Catherine left the infirmary? How are all the other sisters? Have you a postulant yet? How many pupils are in each school? That's referring to the boarding school and the local national school, known as the free classes. How are all the clergymen of Castleknock and All Hallows? Will you have the kindness to remember us most respectfully to our Reverend Father McCann and Father Moriarty? Will you give our most affectionate love to every one of the sisters and ask them to continue their prayers, which have already been so successful? Asking your blessing and prayers, Sister Vincent and Sister Magdalen. We enjoy the best health and spirits, thanks to our good God. I've not had time to read over this letter. End of letter. We look at what emerges from this letter. First, we note not only are the sisters and the 2 girls in a foreign country, but on the very first day are exposed to French, the language of that country. No time for gradual enculturation in those days. It was complete immersion from the very beginning. Luckily, French was on the curriculum of studies in Cabra for the girls, so the sisters already knew some of the language. Mention is made of the Divine Office. This is a reference to a collection of psalms and scripture readings, the official prayer at the church, recited by priests and vowed religious men and women at intervals throughout the day. Parts of the office referred to in this letter are Matins and Lauds, being dawn and morning prayer, while Vespers and Compline are evening and night prayer. The phrase make up cells most likely means they're gone to tidy their rooms. We note too that the children being cared for in the Bon Sauveur convent were referred to as sourds muettes, that is, deaf mutes. We need to read these letters through the lens of readers nearly 200 years ago, when there was less emphasis on politically correct language. Private spiritual reading was called lecture, after its Latin root meaning to read. L'Abbé Fouron, frequently mentioned in the letters, was the nephew of l'Abbé Jamet, already referred to, the founder of Le Bon Sauveur, and of the deaf language which he taught there. There is allusion to the English chat with l'Abbé Fouron. Were they trying to teach him English? The word postulant occurs in the letter. Now, a postulant is someone in the initial stages of discerning whether she is being called to religious life. Questions are asked in the letter about schools, the teachers. We hear about the free classes and Little Cabra, referring to the school for the poorer children, opened shortly after the sisters moved to Cabra in 1819, and well over a decade before the introduction of the national school system in the 1830s. The boarding school for young ladies, named Immaculata, opened in 1835. Next slide, please. Yeah. So what we see here is the the dictionary that was compiled, copied by the sisters from the one they used in Caen. The deaf and dumb language is very difficult and is not yet adapted to English. It was an ambitious program to change it from French to English. Quite a grueling timetable. Now the second letter, some months later, dated the 5th of July, 1846. Dearly beloved, there's a slide.
No, it isn't.
Oh, sorry, there's no slide. Sunday week, we received your welcome letter. We hope to discharge in some degree the debt we owe to the Bon Sauveur in the person of l'Abbé Fouron. He will accompany us. How glad we are. He settled upon the 17th or the 18th of August for our departure, but we must not think of that happy day fearing a disappointment. Our kind and esteemed friend, Monsieur Gabriel, did not forget us. He sent us a list of books enclosed in a letter full of the best advice for the course we shall have to steer henceforth with our beloved sourd muette. You see, dear Reverend Mother, everything concurs to awaken our thanksgiving to our good God. We have every hope of being able to fulfill the commissions you gave us, and will avail ourselves of our dear Reverend Father's kindness by sending the list to Paris. And we're delighted to hear that the warm weather agrees so well with you, and on that account, we pray for its continuance. Madame la Supérieure, the Chasseur, and the other sisters testify their gratitude for your kind remembrance and desire their most respectful compliments. Now, what we see here is my dear Reverend Mother, we would willingly describe the ceremonies of Corpus Christi, but have not time. 6 weeks will not be long in passing. We unite in our most affectionate love to you and every inmate of the both Cabras, in particular, Sister Catherine, who, to our great joy, is so much better. Our sentiments of respect and gratitude to our dear sisters. The Corpus Christi procession that you see here is taken much later, but you notice the young girls with the white bonnets stretching halfway around that procession are the deaf pupils at the time, after so many years after the original foundation. If we can get an assistant for our school, may we bring her home? There is one of the submistresses, deaf and dumb, who is most anxious to go home with us. She would be the greatest acquisition to our establishment, being very well educated and perfect mistress of the method of instructing the deaf and dumb.
Apologies, could I just make an interruption, please, sister?
Yes.
We're looking at the time, and due
Yes.
to time constraints, each presentation has been approximately 20 minutes. So we will have 10 minutes for questions and answers. There is a lot of interesting information that you have presented, but time is going against us at the moment. We were due to finish the conference at 3 o'clock. So just to let you know that we have time constraints at the moment. So if you don't mind closing.
Okay.
All right. Yes.
So if we could give you maybe about 5 minutes in closing.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide. The next slide is slide 13.
No, it's Agnes.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay.
Agnes Reed.
So,
In this thing, you
so
see.
just this is the statue carved by John Hogan, the statue of Agnes Beedham, the first pupil of St. Mary's School for the Deaf. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Okay, these are the books that were referred to, books about teaching the deaf and recommended by Monsignor Bruel. Next letter, the third letter, the final letter. Dear Reverend Mother, we just wished each other joy after retreat. We congratulate you and all the sisters and so on. And we think we should be ready to leave our second home here about the 24th or the 25th.
Yeah, next slide. Next.
So the next slide, please.
Cross right. Oh no, he's doing the third.
Okay, so these are the books that we had referred to and are in our archives.
Now this is it.
Now, this is one of the letters, and one of the obvious things about it is the cross-writing, a space-saving method used at the time. Letters were folded in half and then folded again as in an envelope. And you notice that it's the top there from the convent in Bon Sauveur. Next slide, please. Well, what happened to the two deaf pupils? We know from the records that Agnes Beedham remained in Cabra until 1852. She fell victim to tuberculosis, and Agnes died in 1853. Mary Doherty stayed in Cabra until 1849, but there's no record in our archives as to what became of her afterwards. And the last section of our presentation is about the life of one of the sisters, Sister Gabriel Hogan. Next slide, please. Sister Gabriel Hogan. Okay, so this is a brief outline of her biography, of her life. Born Ellen Mary Hogan, daughter of John and Mary Hogan. Her father was a clerk. She had a brother, Edmund, and the family lived in 26 Wellington Street, Dublin. She left the deaf school in 1864. We take a brief look at the growth and development of the life of this remarkable woman over the next few slides. Next slide, please. And they come quickly one after the other. So next slide. Thank you. So Mary Ellen, 1844, was born to John and Ellen Hogan. She had a passion for music and singing. She was deaf from 1851. Before that, she was hearing. But she contracted scarlet fever, which was the cause of her deafness, and was admitted to St. Mary's School for Deaf Girls and completed her education in St. Mary's. Next slide, please. In 1856, she worked as an assistant teacher in the school and expressed her interest in wanting to become a nun when she was age 13. She got special permission because of her deafness, and a few years later, Cardinal Cullen and Pope Pius IX gave her that permission. And so in 1867, she became a Dominican sister known as Sister Mary Gabriel Hogan, age 23, and devoted her life to teaching deaf children. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Oh no, go back.
So the Catholic Deaf School in Australia, the first pupils were Catherine Sullivan, age 16, and Elizabeth Rewalt, age 10. In 1885, in Australia now, remember, 17 girls and 13 boys are enrolled at the convent for the deaf and dumb. And in 1885, Sister Gabriel received funding from the Archdiocese of Sydney. And in 1886, she founded the first Catholic school for deaf children in New South Wales. Next slide, please. She taught through Irish Sign Language. She was aware of the Milan Congress of 1880's decision to ban sign language. In 1887, teachers of oralism arrived in the school. Sister Gabriel objected to oralism and continued to use Irish Sign Language. Next slide, please. So her 1910, she suffered from poor health. In 1914, attended a school reunion for past pupils, and in 1915 died after a long illness. School continued to use the Irish Sign Language until the 1950s. In 1920, there were more than 200 girls and 100 boys had passed through the school. And in 1976, the school enclosed. So the letters and documents discussed here offer an insight into the lives of some of our deaf pupils. It was a pleasure to share with you. Thank you. And we finish here. And again, I wish to thank also my co-archivists who were very much part of this preparation. Thank you.
Sister Maurice, thank you so much. My apologies for rushing you towards the end because of our time constraints. We are most definitely in receiving more information about this. So we're now going to open your session to a question and answer. So if there's anybody that wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. And you may do so now. Are there any questions? Yes, we do have a question. And the question is coming from Brendan Karen. So we're just waiting for him to turn on his video. Okay, here we go.
Okay, hello, Brendan.
He's just saying, I can't see my cell phone, but just excuse me, just a moment. Okay. Just a very quick question. Now, you spoke about the nuns teaching in Australia, New South Wales. Now, do you know, was it in a city or a town? Do you know the location in New South Wales?
I don't have it on the paper here with me, but it was. But I can look it up and maybe send an email through the Deaf Heritage Centre to answer Brendan's query. Sorry, I don't have the answer right now.
No, you're absolutely fine. That's no problem at all, and thank you. We now have a question from Dominic. Okay. Sister, now you spoke about Sister Gabriel set up a new school, a new Catholic school in New South Wales.
Yes.
And the actual town is called Newcastle. So that's in answer to Brendan's question.
Thank you. Yes, good. Good.
Okay. Now, talking about Sister Gabriel, now a book has been published in Australia. Wasn't it a few weeks ago? Was it Open Mind, Open Word, or something like that? I think 2,000 books were published regarding the life of Sister Gabriel in Australia. So I just thought I'd let you know that.
Yeah.
But thank you for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dominic.
Good afternoon, Sister Marie Stella. How very interesting to know about Sister Gabriel and what she went through in terms of her education and dedicating her life to educating a huge number of deaf boys and deaf girls. Hugely interesting. Now, looking at the picture of Sister Gabriel, is there a possibility of having a copy of that picture as part of our DHC? Because she is to be commended for the work that she had done, for traveling to Australia, for the work that she did. And one part that I really enjoyed you saying was that she objected to oralism, which was the same as the Christian Brothers here in Ireland. So I commend you, Sister Marie Stella, for your presentation today and for sharing the life of Sister Gabriel. Thank you.
Thank you.
For now, we have no more questions. And on that note, I'd like to thank you, Sister Marie Stella, for your highly enlightening presentation.
And I wish to thank all those who participated in today's conference. And it has been a wonderful, enlightening experience in sharing our aspects of the education of deaf girls. So thank you. And thank you.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah.
Okay. Sister Marie Stella was our last presentation. So we're now at the point of concluding our conference. You may remember at the beginning of today, we talked about the importance of collating the history of deaf people through the stories. Yes, stories have been written by hearing people about deaf people. I think the time has come now for deaf people to collate information about deaf people, their successes, their suffering, their struggles, their career, opportunities at university, employment, poverty, crime. I mean, a huge amount of interesting information. We need to keep those memories alive. And also, please do remember, next Wednesday, the 18th of August, Eamon McDevitt, because today we're honouring the memory of him today and dedicating the conference today. We would like to thank our interpreters for their work throughout today. And I would also like to thank the Heritage Council for supporting the Deaf Heritage Centre in providing funding, in providing their logo for this conference. So thanks to them. And before we finally finish, I would like to hand you over to Liam Breen, the chairperson of DHC, for a brief presentation. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for your participation and your attention. And I do hope you enjoyed today's event. Hello, everyone. I apologize for my internet connection this morning. We're experiencing heavy rain here. It looks like I'm back to normal now. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for joining and attending this conference today. It has been hugely interesting with the varied presenters. Highly interesting, each and every one of them. You can see the effort that has been made between Dr. Noel and the DHC team in ensuring that the conference could happen today. Would also like to thank the National Heritage Council for their support and for making today happen. Huge thanks. And lastly, to David Breslin. What I will do is bring to our committee meeting the need to have a honor plaque for Eamon McDevitt. I think this is the consideration that needs to be made with our committee. Should a plaque be produced, it will be in the Thomas Mahon building. And should you wish to be a member of the DHC for updates and newsletter, the membership is of a 2-year duration, whereby you can get a breadth of information of our history. The newsletter, as we have it right now, is doing well. And very soon, there will be a deaf history book that will be produced by the name of The Deaf Glen. We hope the book will be published. I mean, we're looking at 750 pages of this book that is inclusive of stories and pictures of all of the stories that we have here in Ireland. There are some from overseas, obviously, but hugely interesting. So when the book is being launched, we will let you know. And lastly, I would like to thank all of the committee members for their hard work, working as a team, and to organize this event through Zoom. Oh, thank you to Noel and the committee. Dr. Noel, lastly, I would like to say thanks to different people. So the organizing of the conference could not have been made possible without the help of 2 Pacific people. That is Alvin Jones for organizing the meetings and so on, and also Brian Crean for operating the technical aspects of this conference. Without him, this conference would not have happened. So huge thanks to Brian, and all credit to him and to Alvin Jones as well. Okay, that concludes our conference. I wish you good luck. And everyone can turn on their videos if they like. Cheers to everyone. Thanks to Catherine and Veronica for interrupting today.